Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from today. I'm Mohammad Mamadov, a research fellow at the Topchubashov Center, a research Baku-based think tank, and it's a pleasure to moderate today's session titled Türkiye in, Russia down, Iran out, with question mark, shifting tides in the South Caucasus. Over the past several months, the South Caucasus has been undergoing some serious transformations since the end of the Second Karabakh War in November 2020. The Washington Declaration signed on August 8 by Armenian and Azerbaijani leaders has been widely interpreted as milestone in the Armenia-Azerbaijan peace process. Yet it also has raised new questions about the new power balances, external influence, and durability of this emerging regional order. At the heart of today's discussion lies a complex picture. On the one hand, we are witnessing new diplomatic openings in the region. Armenia and Azerbaijan have moved closer to finalizing a peace treaty. Türkiye has positioned itself as a pivotal player linking the South Caucasus to wider Eurasia. And the European Union, United States, and other Western countries are showing renewed interest in the region's connectivity. On the other hand, these shifts are taking place amid global turbulence. Russia's war in Ukraine has weakened Moscow's traditional dominance in the South Caucasus. Iran, after a 12-day war with Israel in June, has become more cautious yet more unpredictable in its regional behavior. It is within this complex regional environment that we'll ask, can a truly stable and inclusive peace emerge in the South Caucasus? To help us unpack these questions, we are joined by three distinguished experts whose insights have shaped policy debate on the South Caucasus for a long time. Zaur Shiriev is a non-resident scholar at Carnegie Russia Eurasia Center. He's a go-to analyst on the Armenia-Azerbaijan normalization and has written extensively on post-conflict regional dynamics. Richard Giragosian is director of the Regional Studies Center in Yerevan, one of the most thoughtful voices on Armenia's domestic politics, regional geopolitics, and security affairs. And finally, Thomas de Waal is one of the most seasoned and insightful observers of the South Caucasus. For over 2 decades, he has covered the region's conflicts, transitions, and peace efforts with a rare combination of historical depth and policy nuance. Currently, Tom is a senior fellow at Carnegie Europe. Dear Zaur, Richard, and Tom, thank you very much for joining us today. So we'll begin. Picture. Could you walk us through the past 2 months since the Washington Declaration was signed? What have been the key developments since then, and where does the peace process stand today?
Thanks, Mohammed. So, first of all, I think I would like to start with saying that actually what strikes me about that discussion about the normalization and the peace really gained momentum on after Washington became involved. But actually, I see this is a much more symbolic than substance, because I think this process is already happening for more than 2 years or exactly 3 years. So that's why, I mean, it shows us the still region is waits for external validation, as the peace becomes real only when it announced from outside. But the region still runs on the signals and symbols, handshakes, statements, but often, less often, I think, the signaling replaces substance. So now, looking after 2 months in Washington Declaration, there are several encouraging developments. I think that first of all, the most important one, I will say, this declaration has acted as a de facto guarantee against escalation. Neither side expect renewed fighting, and that alone helps create small but valuable sense of trust. But also, it's also a good message for the both societies that actually, so right now, many people might be will define the peace as a kind of the at least the stability. Second is the rhetoric has slightly softened, not fully in language of normalization, but less confrontational in media and public discourse. And international also the process is well respected, I will say. So many governments behave as is like that the agreement is signed. Like for example, Pakistan normalized its relations with Armenia. The UK recently lifted the arms embargo on both Azerbaijan and Armenia. So and also the final, the most also one of the important things is that the sharing the draft peace agreement, which was initialed in the Washington. So it also now no one is actually referred to the mystical document. So actually there is a much more transparency. But at the same time, transparency is not a communication because it will be need also explanation to the population. So, but also the two major risk remains, I will say. The one is that so first the next eight months, so leading up to Armenian parliament election in June, will be decisive. So we will see whether this fragile calm can hold or whether the domestic politics interrupts the process. And also the formal peace treaty is still missing. And while I don't exaggerate the importance of the peace treaty, but also the agreement could open a new phase, diplomatic recognition, direct channels, and institutionalized dialogue. Second, the question about the connectivity, I see as a risk, because the TRIP initiative remains more of a political intention right now rather than a functional plan. So we know that there is a negotiation on it, but still it's not a clear roadmap, concrete the guarantees and sustainable financing, and also its success also depends on what others like the European Union, Turkey role will be there. So whether Washington will open such the role. So that's why the key question for my understanding is that whether US can transform TRIP route from a political signal into a practical framework, and whether it can engage partners who can bring both financing and technical know-how. But to move forward as the next 8 months, 8 months is the few things might be. I will talk about this what's recommendation and how to move the forward. But one last thing actually I wanted to say in the beginning is that also there is also US uncertainty about the US commitment. So this is critical. This is a central vulnerability of the process because Azerbaijan and Armenia is heavily investing a partner with a long record of uneven attention to the Caucasus, discovering it then quickly forgetting it. So the second is that there's a risk of overdependence, that when outside actors take the lead, they can unintentionally weaken direct confidence building between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Instead of finding bilateral solution, both sides may start turning to the United States for help for even the small disagreement. So I will stop here. Sorry for taking a little bit more time.
Well, thank you. So Richard, moving to you. So what's your take on that post-Washington situation? One of the early arguments I remember, Zaud also touched up on that point, was that was against the agreement's feasibility. The arguments against the agreement's feasibility was that it could trigger strong domestic opposition in Armenia and further weaken Prime Minister Pashinyan's political standing. Looking at the developments since August, how do you assess the situation now in Armenia?
Well, first of all, from an Armenian perspective, I do think it's now clear that this is a very positive, demonstrable sign of diplomatic momentum. I would even argue we're past the tipping point. The hard part is actually over. I would also clarify, however, the Washington summit, despite much of the attention, is actually more a result of bilateral work by the Armenian and Azerbaijani leaders a month before the White House ceremony in Abu Dhabi. It was only later that the Trump administration secured his own immodestly named project and actually seeking the Nobel Peace Prize, made this as much about President Trump's ego as it was about Armenia and Azerbaijan. But I do think the hard part being over, from a political domestic point of view from Armenia, I really think the government is in a stronger, not weaker position. The political message now being crafted by the incumbent government of Armenia is that the Pashinyan government and leadership move the country closer to peace and further away from war. I do think that's going to be a winning message going into the election next year. However, there is a lingering vulnerability, specifically the issue of Armenian prisoners and detainees currently on trial in Baku, very much an irritant in the longer term viability. We also see the necessity for progress in border demarcation. But I do think finally, most importantly, it's not the initialing of the peace treaty that matters as much as the project on connectivity, the road and rail link, and this Trump route for international peace and prosperity is important in terms of restoring a degree of deterrence through economic interdependence. And I do think the next stage here is, of course, Armenia's normalization with its other neighbor, Turkey. But I'll stop here, and now we can turn to Tom and be corrected.
No correction from me. Mohammed, you were going to ask me a question, or I should just comment on what's been said before.
Sorry. Yeah, it will be more than welcome, please.
Just to comment on what's said before. I mean, I find myself in agreement with both Zoe and Richard, I have to say. Well, first of all, thank you, Mohammed, for convening this webinar. I think it's a good moment to review what's going on. Yeah, for sure, there has to be a balance, obviously, between local ownership of a peace process and external support. And it's hard. It's always hard to get that balance, and I hope that balance can be preserved. And let's recall a major reason why the Americans were able to help make this big step forward, which was that both Armenia and Azerbaijan were having difficult relations with Russia. Both wanted to disavow the November 2020 ceasefire agreement and its ninth provision, which said that the FSB border guards should guard the Sunik route or the Zangezur corridor, however you want to call it. Both sides wanted to break that commitment, but each was hesitant to go first. And if you're going to break a promise to President Putin, then probably the best location in the world to do that is the Oval Office of the White House, and that the Donald Trump gave them the perfect opportunity, and by naming that route after him personally, clearly there are longer term problems with that. But while he's president, I think no spoiler, whether it be domestic or Iranian or Russia, I think is going to want to touch that route for fear of offending President Trump. So I think that was extremely important. Having said that, and my colleagues have already alluded to this, there's an incredible amount of work still to be done. Just to name the connectivity piece, this route, this Trump route, basically establishes a route between two parts of Azerbaijan across Armenian territory. But the Americans want this. They want this for, to be the peacemakers, but they also want this for commercial reasons. They see this as part of the new investments, the Middle Corridor, and so on. And for that to happen, you need to much more heavily involve Turkey, because Turkey needs to, begin to work much harder on opening the border with Armenia. If Armenia will really only cooperate fully, if it benefits Armenia, and that means basically, let's be clear about this, opening the border with Turkey. So there are at least two other routes that need upgrading and opening. It's the Turkey-Armenia border, and it's upgrading of infrastructure across Nakhchivan. Now, I think we've heard that the EU is already getting involved in the Nakhchivan route. My question is, who is going to work on the Turkey-Armenia border? There's another route which is railway which is being built between Kars and Idir to Nakhchivan. That's a long route and it's an expensive route and it bypasses Armenia. For all those reasons, I think Armenians will be less interested in it. And I think Western investors, I think, are less interested in it because they want this to be both a commercial route and a peace building route. This, as I think Winston Churchill said, this is not the beginning of the end, it's the end of the beginning. Many more things need to happen for this to go right. But I think what we've seen in the last few months is definitely the most positive developments we've seen for many years.
Yes, thank you, Tom. And building your points about Turkey, yeah, you touched up on more specifics, but Zar, turning to you about Turkey, this Ankara's regional profile has grown considerably in recent years, from normalizing relations with Armenia to opening new, let's say, corridors to its key partners, Azerbaijan and Central Asia, and probably organization of Turkic states. Simultaneously, Turkey is testing Russian and Iranian waters in Libya, Syria, and even Ukraine. And in some of these theaters, Ankara is acting in tandem with some European partners. So the question is, how sustainable is this outward push about Ankara, and what structural or geopolitical constraints Turkish side could face, and that could limit Turkey's influence in the South Caucasus and Central Asia?
Thank you, Mehmet. I think the Turkish, many of us probably agree that Turkey has a potential to play a bigger role, much bigger role in the South Caucasus and Central Asia. But we need also to differentiate between the Caucasus and the Central Asia. So I would like to touch more the Caucasus than the Central Asia. So one thing is important that Ankara is watching carefully, especially to see when Azerbaijan and Armenia is going to sign the peace agreement. But also we know that behind the scenes, Ankara played an important role, so pushing Azerbaijan and Armenia at least the finalization of the peace treaty text. So, but at the same time, I think there is a little bit of frustration in Ankara. Not really because of the Washington involvement, but because Turkey actually has all instruments to be more active, but at yet is holding back, letting others to take the lead. And so the part of this, as you mentioned, Turkey is busy elsewhere. So from let's say the Middle East crisis, dealing with Syria and others, but also it doesn't mean that actually Caucasus is not important for Turkey. So, but Turkey helped to shape much what we see today in the region. And also it included in early years of the 90s the exclusion of the Armenia because of the conflict from the region. So right now what we are actually expecting that Turkey play a reverse role. So the changing the dynamics or the structure of the Caucasus. So in order to do that, I think that basically we could agree that opening of the border, normalization with Armenia. So normalization is not only the state level, but also the level of the society, because that normalization also can impact a little bit to the people, how to say, to people contact us between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So that's why the Turkey is a waiting room. So, we can discuss so how it can be changed, but it's in the hand of the Ankara. But also what we mentioned, that Tom, Richard, and I earlier mentioned that Turkey also should play a role about this connectivity, because it's obvious But we don't see that Turkey actually the vocal right now about the Trump route or the broader opening in the region. So it will be important to see how the Turkey how to shape its role.
Yeah, definitely. After especially Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Turkey's footprint in the South Caucasus has to a certain extent expanded to the detriment of Russia and Iran, and created some sort of rush for influence in the region. Richard, turning to you, how it is seen from Armenia, how do you see the normalization process with Turkey fitting into Nikol Pashinyan's Real Armenia concept project he recently declared? Given the pressures that Armenia faces in that regard, Nikol Pashinyan government faces both from Russia, externally, and from its own domestic opposition. How resilient is Yerevan's Western-oriented turn and its push to reopen relations with Ankara?
Well, very good questions. If we look first at the outlook for normalization between Armenia and Turkey, it's very important to note there is only one element of Armenian foreign policy that remained unchanged from the previous government, and that was normalization with neighboring Turkey. It was football diplomacy under the past government, and with Pashinyan, a central pillar of his vision for real Armenia. But I would say that for Armenia-Turkey normalization, we do see Turkey being still hostage to Azerbaijan. And the Turkish side, even now, does not yet feel secure or confident enough to fulfill normalization with Armenia. It's waiting for political cover from Armenian-Azerbaijani negotiations. And I do think it's no longer a question of if, but a question of when. And it is a very positive game changer for the region. I would also add, counterintuitively from an Armenian perspective, historically and traditionally, Armenia has long looked to Russia to protect it from a perceived threat from Turkey. In recent years, however, just the opposite. Armenia is looking for a greater role for Turkey, and there is a strategic perception in Yerevan that more Turkey is good because it means less Russia. So I do think it's a matter of time. We also have several breakthrough developments, Turkish Airlines committing to coming to Armenia. We've had the border reopened twice, although on a temporary basis. And I do think it's important that Armenia-Turkey normalization has also attained a degree of progress where the border has not yet reopened, but psychological borders have reopened, just as Howard and Tom were pointing to the importance of the day after in terms of consolidating state-level diplomatic gains with people-to-people contacts. You're muted again, Mohammed.
Sorry, turning to Tom. Tom, how Europe can be, where is Europe in this picture, let's say, in general terms? Because in the context of the Washington Declaration, we saw some discussions that European can be involved in financing and technology, know-how, and regulations. It can share it with Azerbaijan and Armenia. But at the same time, there is capacity issues. Can the EU deliver this because of two main reasons? One is that EU is increasingly internally divided in the context of developments, both internal and external. And at the same time, relations with the United States is going, let's say, negative under the Trump administration. So it can somehow impede the EU's ability to project power in this region. So on the other hand, there are questions that how the EU can contribute to the process without causing the emergence of new dividing lines in the region. Because just two examples, I remember when the EU declared financial assistance to Armenia through European Peace Facility, it was negatively reacted in Azerbaijan. Similarly, EU High Commissioner Kaya Kallas visiting Baku, it was negatively, I remember, reacted in Armenia that why she is visiting Azerbaijan only. So in that regard, how do you see Europe in this wider picture, how they can contribute?
I think Europe is key. Europe is, this is a Europe neighborhood region. Clearly, Georgia is still technically a candidate country, even though that process is obviously completely suspended. Armenia is also, expressing European aspirations. So it's a neighborhood country. The EU now has a Black Sea strategy. It's looking east across the South Caucasus and sees obviously the South Caucasus as the key route to Central Asia, which bypasses both Russia and Iran, which in turn I think it means that there's I think some people are now looking at the necessity for increased economic cooperation with Turkey. So I think Europe is key. Europe is obviously still a slow actor. It doesn't, like Donald Trump, move fast and break things. But that's Trump has done that. But I think we can all probably share the view that Europe is here for the long term in a way that the United States isn't. Europe has, strategic interests in its neighborhood for multiple reasons in the way that the United States doesn't. The United States clearly is the most powerful country in the world. Its attention has landed on this region again, which is positive, but I don't think any of us expect this to be a long-term commitment. Certainly, US soft power in the region is declining at the same time. We're seeing the withdrawal of US aid, Radio Liberty, other US institutions which were key to this region. So I think, inevitably there will be rows. There's still France and Azerbaijan still have a poor relationship. There is, Hungary has a different attitude. But I think this is one region where those differences are smaller, where there is a consensus that there is a European strategic interest. I think what concerns me is a need to speed things up because I think time is absolutely a factor here. And the Americans, I think, are setting a good pace here. And it's up to Europe to match them in speed. Infrastructure time projects can take time, but the sooner that you start building things here and getting financing behind it, the more that you can consolidate this kind of peace dividend on the ground, and peace becomes visible to the local populations.
Yeah, definitely. When it comes to EU, we have been recently seeing the EU's open commitment to the process, as you also mentioned in the latest and first ever Black Sea strategy adopted on May 28 this year, and also EU's increasing focus on the middle corridor and Trans-Caspian connectivity in the context of broader competition over the Central Asia's influence in Central Asia, and that there are questions at how the EU can contribute to bring both Armenia and Azerbaijan this transport corridor and integrate it to the broader East-West connectivity, of course, with peace dividends, creating mutual interdependence between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Moving back to Azerbaijan, Zaur, I would like to ask you about the question on Azerbaijan's long-term strategy, how it sees the peace in the region. After achieving its main military and diplomatic objectives, how do you see Baku can now win the peace? We know it was President Aliyev's advisor, Hikmet Aliyev, said now Azerbaijan's main goal is winning the peace under new circumstances. How do you think, what would it take to integrate Armenia into a predictable regional framework, while at the same time securing at least tacit acceptance from Russia and Iran for the emerging post-war order? Because when we discuss the Washington Declaration in general, we say that you also mentioned that Russia and Iran maybe are not that happy about it. And Azerbaijan is trying to cement, let's say, its diplomatic and military achievements in the new order. How do you think it can do it both with Armenia and, let's say, less satisfied regional powers like Russia and Iran?
Thank you, Mohammed. So, when we talk about winning the peace, I think it's important to remember that winning this war is clear. It has a plan, it has a prescription you can follow, but peace is different. So, it's not something that you sign and it's done. So, it's much more harder to define and it takes time to build. Now I think that for Baku and Yerevan, also for Azerbaijan, is that to make this new reality to work. And to turn everything to become a much more predictable, normal, and stable. I think that this is something. This is the first thing that I will say: stability and restraint. It's a predictable policies. It's about a careful language. There are small things, but they help build the trust. Uh, Even the small gestures and the work on the humanitarian issues also important and can make people on the both sides to feel that something is changing. The second thing is about this. We talk about this connectivity is like something about the between the states, Azerbaijan and Armenia, but we never are actually looking from the perspective of the population. So how also involve the connectivity, how to make the benefit of this the process to the local audience in both sides, Azerbaijan and Armenia. So this is actually a need. It's not only about the trade routes. It's not about the common interest. Otherwise, peace becomes abstract, not a real. So this is something that actually people should benefit from this economically and otherwise from this process. So and they should live tangibly in their life. The third is actually also this normalizing the relations, people to people contact. One example is that the small one is that your co-director, the Murat Muradov, was visit the Yerevan. And such things should happen, and people shouldn't be surprised anymore that why Azerbaijan and Armenia are visiting each other's capitals. So that's why this should be normal, and it shouldn't become a news anymore. So I'm not saying immediately, but over the time. Also the question about how to make the region, how to say, sustainable, also the ownership, probably the part of your question. You know that this is a very good slogan that we always talk about, is regional ownership, regional ownership. But everyone uses this term in the region. But in reality, this is most repeated and but least the practiced the principle in the region. So because ownership works only when the region agrees not just on what it rejects, but also what it wants to build together. So I think we haven't seen this yet. So when we talk about the Azerbaijan, Armenia, and the Georgia, and what we have right now, cordial detente among the three big neighbors, not a partnership but a pause, but also it's also balance, no big confrontation. So in these terms, I think the United States involvement is important, as I think the Tom said that. So this also make others, Iran and Russia, not to see the connectivity. Particularly, this connectivity is a danger. They might feel this, but they will not express this in their policy. So for that, I think need more regional initiatives. Unfortunately, the Georgia is outside of the process for obvious reasons, but also there is also chance that the Western countries, especially EU, can support this regional ownership by involving Azerbaijan and Armenia. But again, the issue about how to involve the Georgia to this process. So basically, the three countries need to work on their common interests, common projects, the small but important one. This is how you can define, let's say, the stability. So it's not only about this, because we always look to also the powers, the Russia, Iran, how the others will do, but less actually attention goes to how these three countries can play their role. So this is very abstract. So in my speech also, it's very abstract, I know.
Yeah, definitely. This is famous, we call agency of increasing agency, strengthening agency of these countries in regional affairs, especially again after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. But in the case of Azerbaijan, I think it was in your article in Foreign Affairs, I remember, in Precarious Power of Azerbaijan, you discuss it's like a fine balance between agency and overextension. Right now, Azerbaijan is like trying to be regionally very active, regional leader sometime on some issues, which shows not only Azerbaijan but Armenia also are seeking their own agency vis-a-vis their relations with great powers, regional and international, especially Russia. But at the same time, there is this danger of overextension in relations with these countries that can cause some balancing measures, especially again from Russia and Iran, where since sometimes they are conducting joint military exercise in the Caspian Sea and some certain coordinating measures in Ukraine, and it can be very easily repeated in the South Caucasus too. Of course, if they consider their interests openly breached. So this brings me to Richard, how it is. I think I would also ask the same question to you. What is Armenia? How it is seen from Armenian side to win the peace? Yeah, so beyond simply reaching an agreement that would, what would a sustainable post-conflict order look like for Armenia? One that protects its sovereignty, manages relations with its neighbors, and restores public confidence after years of war fatigue.
Well, I think as important as the agreements themselves were, it's the implementation and consolidation that is equally significant. For Armenia, I would say the real focus is on the day after, how to invest in a durable, lasting normalization. Between Armenia and Azerbaijan, we also have lessons from Armenia-Turkey to leverage that synergy. But I do think, first of all, for Armenia-Azerbaijan, there's one big advantage. We are now down to only one precondition. That's the demand by Azerbaijan for Armenia to change its constitution. The Armenian government has already begun the process. Therefore, it would be very helpful that there are no new unexpected preconditions coming from Baku. And a related element, equally important, is the nature of the discourse. In other words, the demonization of Armenia, the use of rather aggressive bellicose rhetoric from Azerbaijan does nothing to help the situation. In fact, it undermines the Armenian government. And in this context, the Pashinyan government is the best interlocutor the Azerbaijanis could hope for. And I do think there needs to be a de-escalation to probably not fan the flames in terms of the narrative. In this context, there is a necessity to broaden the constituency, not just for peace, but for normalization of relations. And I do think another outstanding precedent would be the need for further progress on the border, where we do have, as of today, we still have an Azerbaijani military presence on sovereign Armenian territory. We still have outstanding issues like enclaves to be settled, as well as the Armenian prisoners still on trial in Baku. These will be important issues that, if addressed and resolved, can contribute to a much more positive environment, a climate change more conducive to normalizing relations.
Thank you, Richard. Tom, what do you think about these points from Richard and Zaur, especially about the emergence of a new status quo in the region, stable one, in the context of the ongoing wars in the north and south, Russia, Ukraine, and still ongoing tensions and probability of a new war between Iran and Israel?
Yeah, well, I've been covering this conflict far too long, and anyone like me who's seen we've seen many false dawns in this process. We've seen many times when we thought there was going to be a deal over Karabakh, and of course Karabakh Nagorno-Karabakh basically no longer exists. So we've seen many false dawns, and many things can still go wrong. Let's be clear about this. Reference has been made to the Armenian election. Pashinyan's rating has gone down considerably, and at the moment if he wins, it's because he's the least unpopular politician in Armenia. It's not because he's terribly popular, and we know that opposition candidates in post-Soviet countries can emerge out of nowhere quite quickly. So let's not be complacent about that. We know that Iran and Russia are not happy with this deal, and that they're not kind of opposing it openly and aggressively, but they will look for ways to weaken it or to kind of bend it to their own agenda. And we know that populations who've lived on different sides of the border, it won't be easy when the day the border opens. All it takes is one group of young men with a bag of stones to go across and smash some windows on the other side, and we could have a bad incident, and that can happen both on the Armenia-Azerbaijan border and the Armenia-Turkey border. So it does need a lot of investment to make this work. And let me remind you that there's a well-known statistic about peace processes that more than half, or around half, let's say, of peace agreements fail within 5 years. So it's not just the signing, it's the implementation, it's the societal rollout, it's the societal buy-in to this. And this is probably, we're talking about 2 generations of people who've been socialized into the idea that Armenia or Azerbaijan is our existential enemy. And to get rid of that stereotype is also going to take time. So I'm also more on the positive side because I believe this can be done, but I think let's not underestimate how much work needs to be done in the implementation phase of this.
Definitely. My last question, then I'll move to questions from our chat, is of course, as all you three mentioned, there are serious domestic, regional, and international variables that can impede the process that we can still see in the near future. But in that context, my question is about the regional one. So we have this 3+3 initiative, and Russia, Turkey, and Iran on one side, and Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia on the other. And when it comes to these three major powers, it's interesting that on the one hand, they are competing with each other for influence in the South Caucasus, but at the same time, all three share this common understanding that they are against external, especially Western, encroachment in the South Caucasus. In that context, how do you see the near future of this pendulum, on which side it may swing, more of a competition, or they can come together toward of, let's say, so-called external encroachment in the region? And of course, what is the implication for the regional stability? Zaur, can we continue with that?
I have a short answer to this question. So I wouldn't say that three countries are competing open. There's open confrontation. So so they have a different interest, and this was the case for many years, or even a century. So we can talk about the region. So it's not going to change. So I mean, so this is ongoing, and this will continue. But I think that truly we need to look at or to change or to make us stabilizing the force in the region. And that's why we mention always Turkey, because it has a capacity, it has a role, and it's a connection. But also Turkey would like, we saw this as an opportunity. Also, it's part of its dialogue with Western countries, with EU and United States. So Turkey also see this as a kind of the contributing to its own agenda, let's say, when it talking to the United States or the Western on other issues. So that's why Turkey also would like to promote itself, kind of not a extension of the Western interest here, but also kind of the middle power that play the most role. So this is the positive scenario. We can see that Turkish they're playing a role. Other than that, I think if they were not United States but the EU let's say, if you had let's say, the deal not in Washington or in Brussels, I will say that there will be much more opposition from the Russia and the Iran, and because and they will use the different language and aggressive language. So and because right now both has their own agenda items discussing with the United States now or the future. So that's why they are less. More restrained, so they are not let's say aggressively provoking. But I also agree that in the behind the scenes, also they are not happy with this deal. So right now, what we have in the, at least let's say the region is that we cannot make a prediction, longer term prediction. The best prediction we can make next 8 months, or even after 8 months, I wouldn't talk that what will happen. So because everything is related to the Armenian election somehow, at least the process and also the transformation of the region. So in this terms, I think the Turkish role will be decisive in this things, but also how much the United States also to work with the Turkey and European Union on this connectivity to make it practical. This is also important. It's also for own sake of the United States. So this is the two parameters I can say. So as I said, I cannot talk longer term, so how the Caucasus stability will look like, but at least for shorter term, transformative power is Turkey, but also everything is in the hand of the Azerbaijan and Armenia to do the more work, as Tom rightly pointed out.
Yeah, definitely. Why I ask that question is sometimes discussing the geopolitics in the region, we refer to further regionalization of the international politics in the South Caucasus. That was especially the case after Second Karabakh War. We saw 3+3 initiative countries becoming more active and sometimes warning of external involvement. Especially Russia was trying to be the key mediator against the EU and US involvement. Yeah, in that context, can we see, Richard, if you try to answer the same question, will be very good, that the further regionalization of international politics in the South Caucasus, how possible is that, and what would be the implications for smaller countries in the region?
Well, I specifically have 3 distinct comments or observations regarding this question. First is, we see a notable demonstration of welcome political will from the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan. Never before have we seen such readiness and political will from both sides at the same time. However, my first point here is we've had the luxury of attaining progress because of a window of opportunity. Russia's overwhelmed and distracted by its failed invasion of Ukraine has granted us the luxury of bilateral negotiations without Russian ability to interfere. This window of opportunity is closing, in my opinion. And my second point is, no matter what happens in Ukraine, I do expect an angry, vengeful Russia lashing out at all of her neighbors in the near abroad, and a resurgent Russia seeking to regain its lost power and influence in the Caucasus, hence the necessity for resilience. I also think that a third trend is often underestimated. It's an over-the-horizon emergence of third countries, from Israel and Pakistan with Azerbaijan to India and others with Armenia, and most notably China. In fact, if there's one big strategic vacuum, it's the opportunity for China to re-engage in the former Soviet space. But I do think these 3 elements also serve as an impetus and an incentive for the countries of this region to achieve more directly and to focus on resilience together prior to this onset of a resurgent Russia or outside interference. And in this way, for Armenia and Azerbaijan, more than Georgia, there's a realization that you don't choose your neighbors. And this is an accommodation and an adjustment to a difficult past and geography. Georgia is moving quickly in the opposite direction, unfortunately, meaning that for Armenia and Azerbaijan, there is an increasing awareness of the shared challenge from Russia. And in conclusion, it's most important to say there is no conclusion. This is very much a dynamic process, not a static analysis, as Howard has pointed out.
Yeah, definitely. That the argument that uh, especially before 2020, the region, in terms of great power politics, it was mostly bipolar system. At that time, we were calling the region in between countries, stuck between Russia-led and EU-led integration projects. And after that, we have been increasingly seeing, as you said, third powers being more active in the region. Tom, do you have something to add that 3+3 question?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see how this 3+3 idea kind of shot to prominence and now is rapidly disappearing again. I think those three regional powers possibly had ambitions which were not matched by their capacities. I think that's particularly true in the case of Russia. I'm sure I agree with Richard for sure that Russia has ambitions for the South Caucasus, but I think its capacities are greatly reduced by many factors. And I don't think Russia certainly has blocking power in the South Caucasus, but I don't think it has any longer strong hegemonic power. And I think, both Iran and Turkey possibly also had greater ambitions than they can implement as well. I think a bit of humility is required for everyone, all the outside powers in the Caucasus. But these three, they're absolutely very important countries. But they also, let's not forget that each of them has historical baggage. They're each former imperial powers in this region, and many people, locals in the region, don't forget that. So I see this South Caucasus basically now as a kind of geopolitical marketplace, lots of many players, many transactions going on. It's very complicated, and I think which is I think an additional reason why Armenia and Azerbaijan need to get into this new paradigm of working together rather than competing, because otherwise, they could lose together rather than win together in this extremely contested. It's more, economically contested, I would argue, than militarily contested, but economically contested space that now South Caucasus is becoming.
Yeah, definitely. I'll now take questions from the chat. We have Richard, you also touched upon that China. Of course, Beijing has recently been more active player in the region, especially in terms of infrastructure. So, Richard, if I may, I'll ask this question to you. The question is, can China's growing infrastructure investment in the South Caucasus translate into political influence?
Well, the easy answer is a short-term no. I do seriously see trepidation, hesitancy in China. The Belt Road Initiative has gone. It is over. And if we look at the Chinese leadership, the unexpected domestic economic problems, as well as challenges from American tariffs, has really turned China back inward in its focus. The other exception here is Russia's reliance on China, the golden opportunity for China to benefit from Russia's failed invasion of Ukraine. China, in many ways, globally is the one and only winner if we look at the strategic picture. I think the South Caucasus for China may return as an important, perhaps secondary byproduct of a much larger vision. But the short answer is China is used by Georgia, by Armenia to a degree, rather than Chinese commitment or interest into this rather secondary, somewhat remote, and still isolated region?
Yeah, in some discussions, I've seen some experts arguing that China can serve some kind of a balancing mechanism. Yeah, improving relations with China could serve some kind of a balancing mechanism against Russia's maybe growing assertiveness in the future. They are arguing this in the context of the recently signed strategic partnership agreements with the South Caucasus countries. They signed with Georgia in 2023, with Azerbaijan, it's more comprehensive strategic partnership agreement in April this year, and of course, most recently with Armenia. So, Zaur, maybe you would like to comment on this. Can it serve some kind of a balancing mechanism against Russia, or it's too hyped an argument?
I mean, so it's not a. I don't think the Caucasus is not a Central Asia, so that's why they will not be kind of the China-Russian, how to say, geopolitical influence as we see in Central Asia, and also role. And so Caucasus is different, the place. I liked what Tom said, that is right now geopolitical marketplace, but also might be also even marketplace, we can call it. So it's about economic influence of the different the powers, who has the political the power or influence in the region. So in that sense, I think that for China, what's important that all three countries would like to see the China's investment, China's role. But also there's a growing concern that the over-dependence that we see some Balkan countries or some other countries, that actually how the over-dependence to China's finance makes the country, how to say, the problematic nature in economy and the future. So this is not happening yet in the Caucasus, but it could happen. So this is the moment that that's why the region's countries should see that China as a part of the economic diversification rather than actually so a new overdependence or economic investment part. This is how I see the Chinese role. I wouldn't say China will play as I said, the key role as it has in the Central Asia, different realm in the Caucasus and the Central Asia in this case.
Yes, Tom, do you have something to add to this one?
No, I think it's all been said. I think we shouldn't exaggerate Chinese interest in this region. China has three routes to big trade routes, still through the northern route through Russia, still the maritime route through the Suez Canal, which is the cheapest route, although the slowest. The middle corridor route, I think, is being talked up quite a lot, but it will, it will still be a distant third in the east-west routes between Europe and China.
Yeah, and we have another question about Georgia. Um, uh, so the question is why Georgia is not involved as a country which is close to both Baku and Yerevan, but is not so far actively involved in the kind of normalization process, maybe. And the question is, can it be because it would, I mean, successful Armenia-Azerbaijan normalization would decrease Georgia's strategic importance in the region? Richard,
Right.
can you?
Yeah, no, okay, Richard, take that.
Yeah, please.
All right, let me turn to this quickly. I really think the Georgian government is focused on challenging and defying its own population. It's moving quickly away from even the aspirations of European values and ideals. It doesn't have the attention span to really play strategic games with Armenia-Azerbaijan. It's much more inward focused. It's a Georgian government that has put itself in the corner and sees any de-escalation as a sign of weakness. It's a very dangerous tinderbox that's unfortunately getting worse. And I do think Georgia, because of this, is the only real loser from the recent diplomatic breakthrough between Baku and Yerevan. It will lose its monopoly on trade, transport, and transit, and the further away from Europe Georgia moves, the more destabilizing the Georgian component of this three-country South Caucasus region becomes.
Yeah, Zaur, would you like to add to this?
And the easiest part is that why the Georgia is not involved in negotiation or facilitation, because there's no need. I think it's not about the Georgia, because I think that at least the 2 years or more, we see that Azerbaijan and Armenia preface the bilateral talks. And also, okay, the question could be why the leaders are not meeting in Tbilisi but in Abu Dhabi, but also it's also geopolitical reasons. So when they meet in Abu Dhabi, but also it's kind of the involvement of the Abu Dhabi Emirates in this process on investment to attract the air. So they have also their own agenda. So, but basically, there wasn't any need of the Georgian facilitation. Georgia played a once role, kind of the how to say exchange of the detainees some time ago, I mean a few years ago, but nothing more. So that's why sometimes I think in our discussion we exaggerate this. Not importance, but also expectation of the role that Georgia should play. So, I mean, I never been in this side that actually Georgia should facilitate or do that, do this. So that's why there's no need. First part. Second part, also, I wouldn't say that the Georgia is going to lose a lot. So let's not to. I wouldn't use this term to say that Georgia is going to lose immediately. So because also the process of Azerbaijan-Armenia transport trade, it's a long-term process. So it will immediate benefit we will not see. So the most probably after 5-10 years we can compare that who lose, who actually gains. So. But in terms of the monopoly, yes, it's going to lose, but it's not, let's say, immediately, but for the long term. It also depends how Azerbaijan and Armenia develop its own the trade routes and the transport economy. So it also depends on Azerbaijan and Armenia how this track is going.
Definitely. We are short on time, some 10 minutes. I kindly urge you to ask your questions from chat. But till the time, I think I'll ask you my final question, a bit more general, but Zaur, as you also said in the beginning, so where we are going from here, yeah, your future perspectives of this, let's say, Armenia-Azerbaijan normalization and involvement of third parties in that. I will kindly ask you individually reply this, and if there is a question from chat, I'll ask and we'll conclude. Tom, can we start with you, please?
You know, I think Mohammed, we've kind of said it all clearly. In the short term, you know, as we've said, the next months leading up to the Armenian election are crucial. This peace agreement has been initialed but not signed. The work is only just beginning on the trip, which is just one section, and work needs to be done on other connectivity routes. So, you know, I'm afraid I'm going to stop repeating myself and just say this is the end of the beginning. This is, I think, a time for, you know, increased engagement. You know, I can just share with you one thing. I'm sitting in London and I've been talking recently to the Foreign Office, you know, and I obviously won't share any details, but I can say that they in London, which is, you know, was never part of the Minsk group, it has always been a bit detached from the peace process, that there's a very active interest in supporting the Trump initiative, supporting the EU. You know, we're not part of the EU, but we can, but you know, many more meetings with European partners than before. I think it was only yesterday that Britain lifted its arms embargo on both countries, which was a symbolic step that in saying, you know, that we no longer fear war, and these are two grown-up countries. We trust them in their arms purchases. Britain, I think, will support the dissolution of the Minsk group. So, you know, there's just a small bit of evidence that one European country, I think, is showing more attention to this region, and that hopefully that will be, you know, a positive positive circle, a positive cycle. You know that the more that there is positive signs in the region, there'll be more investors will be interested, the more attention politicians will show to the region. But let's again, I think, say what we said many times in the last hour. This is a very long-term thing. There's a lot more work to be done.
Yeah, Richard, do you have something to add to that?
Actually, I do, but very briefly. As someone who chose to move from the United States and live in Armenia, I'm finally justifiably optimistic. And the reason is Armenia has attained an unprecedented degree of democratic credentials and is endowed with a rare commodity of legitimacy, which gives fresh hope to the day after this diplomatic breakthrough. I also think that in many ways, we are moving into this new period in terms of, as Tom would say, the end of the beginning. But I do think what today's event represents, this kind of collaboration, cooperation, is actually most important for providing a bottom-up consolidation of these gains. But more than that, for Armenia, it's about reasserting independence after years of dangerous overdependence on Russia. It's about leveraging the European Union monitoring mission to Armenia and actually deepening Armenia's ties, not just with the West, but diversifying security partners globally. So I do think we should expect more discussion, but also more positive developments to focus on.
Yeah, and Zaur, we can maybe conclude with that, with you and maybe your view from Azerbaijani point of view.
I mean, I already said what I can say, so that's why I say that. So we cannot. So we need a much more also responsibility, less slogan, and so to see how the next 8 months to bring to us and how the sites are going to work, and so how this positive agenda will continue. But also the last point, probably we need also to think about not collectively might be Azerbaijan and Armenia, it's not ready yet, but what peace means. So we need also definition of the peace. So because sometimes or already peace is actually the threatening the terminology for various reasons. While you are Azerbaijan or Armenia, it doesn't matter. It matters. Context is different, but also need the people to work to define the peace a more constructive way and also to tangible way, which actually the government has a responsibility about to make the peace tangible for population to understand and to feel.
Definitely. We have some 3-4 minutes, so we have a message in the chat. So, Richard, I'll ask you this. The question is, do you believe the referendum on the change to the Armenian constitution is likely to fail? If so, how do you believe this scenario will play out?
Well, I think it's an open question. The real threat is not from a no vote, but from inadequate voter turnout. The Armenian government, however, more recently has decided to focus on its re-election first and later hold the referendum on changing the constitution. But to be honest, it's too soon to say.
Okay, I think we can stop here. Thank you, Zaur, Tom, and Richard, for your insights. It was, I'm sure, very helpful for our viewers. And thanks our viewers for watching us, sharing this time with us. And I wish to see you all in our next upcoming webinars. Thank you for your time all.
Thank you.
Thank you.